A reading from the Acts of the Apostles. After this, Paul left Athens and went to Corinth. There he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all Jews to leave Rome. Paul went to see them, and because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them, and they worked together. By trade, they were tent makers. Every Sabbath he would argue in the synagogue and would try to convince Jews and Greeks. When Silas and Timothy arrived from Macedonia, Paul was occupied with proclaiming the word, testifying to the Jews that the Messiah was Jesus. When they opposed and reviled him, in protest he shook the dust from his clothes and said to them, "Your blood be on your own heads, I am innocent. From now on I will go to the Gentiles." Then he left the synagogue and went to the house of a man named Titius Justus, a worshipper of God. His house was next door to the synagogue. Crispus, the official of the synagogue, became a believer in the Lord, together with all his household, and many of the Corinthians who heard Paul became believers and were baptized. So we have Paul having returned from this very rich time, proclaiming the word in Athens, and now here he is in a new context. And we hear really this classic struggle in the early time of the church, the early believers, and you can hear it's one foot in the world of synagogue worship and traditional Judaism, one foot in the camp of people who are proclaiming a new thing. And we hear of Paul here trying to hold those worlds together in a particular way, speaking, working sort of 9 to 5, as it were, as a tent maker, and then spending his weekends proclaiming and exhorting in the context of the synagogue, and trying to help his fellow believers of the Jewish faith, helping them to understand that Jesus is the promised Messiah. And of course, we know he comes up against some significant resistance to that. And just as a reminder, we know that in the book of Acts, we are hearing how the church is going through everything that Jesus went through in the Gospel of Luke. Luke and Acts hold together as a 2-volume set, written, we believe, by the same author or authors. And so we have this resistance coming from traditional church, if you will, traditional congregations of belief. And so here we have Paul trying to bring into his existing world this new proclamation and having mixed success. He's not only rejected in the synagogue, and we hear at the very end of today's reading that in fact one of the leaders or the official of the synagogue became a believer in the way, and he and his whole family were baptized. So it strikes me that as we are taking ourselves through this, the journey of the early church, it's interesting to see all the ways that in our time we can see some common strands, including this strand of hybrid, as we ourselves are emerging from a time of chaos and difficulty in our common life caused by the pandemic. As we come back into the fullness of in-person worship, we're finding ourselves, it's neither one thing nor the other. We're finding that as a church broadly, and including us at St. James, finding ourselves invited into a world that's emerging and is in some way hybrid. And just as you can hear the hybrid in this early church that is being described in the book of Acts, where we have people who consider themselves devout Jews and people who consider themselves followers of Jesus, and people who believe they're both, and people who believe that the one or the other is an abomination. There's a lot going on, and we have faithful leaders of the church coming and going and being open to the Spirit and what the Spirit is doing in the midst of them in their particular context. So may their journey through this and their persisting and their successful persisting through all of this be an encouragement to you and me as we continue on in our own journey, as we continue on in the life of our church, being open to God's Spirit and what God's Spirit is inviting us into. What new things, what old things, what combination of things are we being invited into? What are we being invited to leave behind if we must? But knowing that God is faithful, God is calling us, God says it's okay if you're coming up against resistance, you can simply let something lie and God will take care of it all. But knowing that what you and I are called to do is to grow ever more deeply in our relationship to Christ, ever more deeply in our relationship to one another, ever more deeply in our relationship to our own faith, and how to share that with others. And may God bless all of our efforts in doing so. And may God bless you and keep you this day and always. Amen.